There are a few comments that I'd like to make here before we get into our generalized discussion about teaching military history. First is the fact that we want you to realize that historians certainly don't always agree. I know this is always a problem with our weekends because we'll typically have a speaker on a particular war or general or topic, and they may give a particular viewpoint that's not shared by everybody else. And we want you to understand you need to engage in dialogue, with the speakers. If you have a question about a content item or something, raise it, and I encourage our other speakers to mix it up in a friendly way, of course, with each other so that we can clarify things. I mean, Andrew Jackson's a good example. Obviously, there are plenty of folks out there who think he's horrible and think he's great, so there should be lively discussion, about that. And of course, as a teacher, I'm always prejudiced in the moderate position, encouraging my students to hear both sides and form their own opinions, by historical research and inquiry. So I'm going to remove Winfield Scott from the screen for a moment here. I know a lot of you heard the song before that I was playing, the Battle of New Orleans, right? Johnny Horton. All of you familiar with it? I was concerned that some of you perhaps have not heard the Canadian response. I thought this might just cheer you up for a moment. A group called the Arrogant Worms, which is kind of a Canadian capital step, but not really.
Thank you so much.
Oh, come back, proud Canadians, to before you had TV. No hockey night in Canada. There was no CBC.
Oh, my God!
In 1812, Madison was mad. He was the president, Well, he thought he'd tell the British where they ought to go. He thought he'd invade Canada. He thought that he was tough. Instead, we went to Washington and burned down all his stuff in the White House. Burn, 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 and we're the ones that did it. It burned, 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 while the president ran and cried. It burned, 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 and things were very historical. And the Americans ran and cried like a bunch of little babies. Wah, 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 in the War of 1812.
Us hillbillies from Kentucky, dressed in green and red, left home to fight in Canada, but they returned home dead. It's the only war the Yankees lost except for Vietnam.
And also the Alamo.
Right, and the Bay of Ham. The loser was America, the winner was ourselves.
So join right in and gloat about
the War of 1812 in the White House. Burn, 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 and we're the ones that did it. It burned, 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 while the president ran and cried. It burned, 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 and things were very historical. And the Americans ran and cried like a bunch of little babies. Wah, 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 in the War of 1812.
In 1812, we were just sitting around, minding our own business, putting crops into the ground.
We heard the soldiers coming, and we didn't like that sound.
So we took a boat to Washington and burned it to the ground. Oh, we fired our guns, but the Yankees kept it coming. There wasn't quite as many as there was a while ago. We fired once more, and the Yankees started running down the Mississippi to the Gulf of Mexico. Whoa, whoa, whoa.
When they ran through the forest, they ran through the bushes where the beavers wouldn't go. They ran so fast they forgot to take their culture back to America and Gulf and Texaco. Whoa, whoa.
So, if you go to Washington, its buildings clean and nice. Bring a pack of matches and we'll burn the White House twice in the White House. Burn, 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 but the Americans won't admit it. It burned, 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 it burned and burned and burned. It burned, 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 now that made them mad. And the Americans ran and cried like a bunch of little babies. Wow, wow, wow.
I don't think I'd want it for a ringtone, but I do spend a lot of time using music when I'm teaching U.S. history, and I thought that would be kind of a fun thing for those of you not familiar with it. Easy to download, lyrics available. On a somewhat different subject, how many of you out there teach advanced placement U.S. history? Hands, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. How many of your schools offer AP U.S. history? Okay. The reason I mention this is in the year 2014, 2015, there's going to be a redesign of that entire course, unlike anything that's happened since it started in 1956. And the current course right now bills itself as not being a military history course. In other words, you can teach military history, but it does not spend a lot of time evaluating military history. Causes and results of wars are the most common questions that appear on the exam. In the redesign, the entire focus of the course and exam is changing to historical skills, inquiry techniques, and major themes. And the content is far less prescribed than has ever been the case, and the exam itself and the questions are changing. And one of the ironies of this is this does open the door to teaching some military history in the course now, because the depth that's provided in the course will be up to the individual instructors rather than the full content of an entire survey. So while not everybody's going to be pleased with this redesign, and I'm not quite sure where I stand on the subject myself, but I'll be adopting it since I do teach for it. I do think there will be the chance here for people to offer a much greater depth of military history in a particular theme. So if you'd always wanted to do that 2-week unit on the Civil War, involving strategy and tactics and so forth, it will now be available to you. Because you won't have to literally cover a full survey content in all areas. So it's just something to keep in mind, and if any of you have questions about this subject, you could see me later on. I have been retrained for the redesign, so I'll be glad to share with you. Michael and I and Walter, we're here now to try and engage you in a discussion about teaching military history and teaching about great man theory versus social history and how all of this can be incorporated in your courses. We'd like to know what's going on in your own districts. Everyone's got a microphone out here. We will have handheld mics as well. And who'd like to begin? Again, we're talking about what do you do in terms of teaching about the subject of this weekend, for example? I mean, we'd start right there. What do you folks do about these captains? Do you specifically teach Andrew Jackson, George Washington, Winfield Scott, or do you teach just where they are in a particular historical unit that you're covering, or do you not focus on the individuals at all? Just turn your placard, press your button, and speak. Go.
I'm infantry, so I'll take the lead here. But if I could just make a general comment, I think we all realize we've got a big challenge to do this. The difficulty I have is getting students to connect. Where I'm in Virginia, I have a lot of resources that get me places. But the one thing that I remember, the one thing that kind of pulled me up as an instructor in trying to take the students to places and stand on the ground and tell them what happened there and trying to get them to connect was standing at Redoubt number 10 at Yorktown. And I was standing there saying it right here was where our history was, or our freedom was secured. And I guess I went on a little bit, but one young lady in the back raised her hand and said, Colonel King, you're excited. Should we be? And that really kind of pulled me up because I realized that they weren't, we weren't being able to connect. But I think, and I've talked to some of my friends about that, or some of the people I've met here, if you can make a connection and like if they had somebody in the military and start at that level, I've had some success tying them to, if somebody was in World War II, then you can go on and tie them into some of the great captains, but you can start at that level where they have a personal connection.
Okay, thank you.
I'd like to add on to that. I teach Air Force Junior ROTC, and obviously I'm interested in the aerial history component of it, but what I find is that I get a lot of kids who take ROTC, but they also teach other history courses, but they cannot connect the events together. As an example, one of the questions I ask is name one weapon that was used for the first time in World War I, and you'd be surprised how many times I get the atomic bomb. Okay, so these kids just don't have a concept, and the way I like to say, how can I teach a kid about air power in World War II when he doesn't even understand World War II or the events that go around him? But as far as the great captains go, what I've been making copious notes on are looking for common threads of commonality between these great leaders and sharing that with the kid. But I like to amend or comment on what Dave just said. I fully agree that a lot of our kids have lost touch with the military. And I teach at a school that's 5 miles from Scott Air Force Base, and a lot of our kids are military, but they don't have a connection, a real connection with anybody in the military. And it's kind of hard for them to identify with that because fewer and fewer people are veterans and fewer people have served.
Thank you.
I don't have a military history course or anything like that, so I only teach military history in the context of teaching world history, which is my primary focus. But I spend a lot of time trying to connect our students to the role of great leaders in history, especially George Washington's one of my favorites. I was glad we got to speak about him. Because I've traveled to a number of countries now with the military trying to set up some governments in Africa, in Iraq, in Kosovo, and they need a George Washington. And how do you find a George Washington? I don't know how you find a George Washington. If they could find a George Washington, it'd be great. How do we develop foreign policy that helps us to find a George Washington for them or helps them find so we spend a lot of time talking about those sorts of things. What was his role? And also on citizenship and the role of citizenship, and how these great leaders provide a role model. We heard some talk of, who was it? Who was Grant emulating Taylor, right? And, we hear about other leaders who have emulated George Washington. Ho Chi Minh, great fan of George Washington's. And I try to make those connections in the context of world history.
Shanna Heath, Danville High School. And unless I misunderstood your question, were you looking for tools that teachers use effectively in a classroom teaching military history? I wrote down a few that I use. I have probably a different student population. I've got a group of English language learners, some of the learning needs special ed population, but for different learning styles and different learning groups. One that's a lot more interactive, I'll give projects to. We do simulations a lot, like Revolutionary War dodgeball, where you draw parallels between letting them play a game and the war itself. For example, you divide them up in 2 teams. You give the least experienced players the most experienced captain. It's like Washington with the Continental Army. Or with my English language learners, they often don't have the language necessary to convey the ideas about military history, but we can do body biographies. So they will take really giant pieces of paper, trace a student on it. They will use symbolism to portray something. One group did Napoleon, so they drew him on his horse, and they drew, I'm trying to think of another one more relevant to U.S. history. If you were drawing Grant, you could draw a bottle of whiskey, maybe. Or, I'm sorry, excuse me. Let me pick another one. If you were drawing Andrew Jackson, you could draw,
I gather it's going to be quite an uphill battle
gotcha.
to elevate Grant from the bottom 10 list.
Yes, I'm trying to bump them up there. And then just timelines with graphic illustrations on the timeline that somehow represent the event, the battle that you're talking about, and then giving a description. I don't know if that's what you were looking for or not, but that's what a lot of our teachers at our school try to do, to give different type learners different options and activities,
right,
and to teach that way.
Thank you.
Well, I'm from the Detroit area, and I'm Bob Bluth from Kensington Woods High School, by the way, in Howell, Michigan. From the Detroit area, and we are fortunate because we have a couple of fantastic places in the Detroit area, the Greenfield Village, Henry Ford Museum, and we also have Fort Wayne. And just to give you an example, I told my kids last year that I was going to take them to Fort Wayne, and we were going to go visit Fort Wayne and what the significance of Fort Wayne was in our history, and they thought I was taking them to Indiana. Not to downtown Detroit. We also have Mackinac Island, and we have the forts up there from the War of 1812 and all those really cool places. But what I have done in the past, and what I want to do now, coming through a class like this, is we would emphasize those particular people that were influenced at that point in time, not necessarily great generals. Mad Anthony Wayne, of course, comes to play because of where we're located at. Lewis and Clark. Was it Clark? I think that was one of the great people in the War of 1812. And we would touch base with that, give them an idea and experience. But it's kind of tough to talk about the great captains of history, like, unless you can take some specific time, unless you have a specific military class that you can give it to. And that's what I want to design, especially for my 9th and 10th graders. Is I want to design a military class where we can talk about the great leaders, and we can talk about the great captains, and we can talk about the great battles, and why they're considered great captains, more than anything else. So my purpose for coming to this particular seminar was to get information on that, to design a class that would go beyond what we have now, which is taking them to places, talking about the things that pertain to the Michigan area, but not necessarily in the overall basis like the Civil War. Other applications like that, of that nature.
Okay, good. Thank you. We have a whole slew of comments coming here.
I can tell you from New York State's perspective, we're so test-driven. I can tell you Winfield Scott is not an answer on a multiple-choice test. That's the problem. So that's what we're up against. And now our evaluations are based on these exams, so that's the difficulty that we face. I'd love to spend more time on that, but that's the problem.
So you still feel that because of the nature of the exam, your content's going to have to be tailored right around the region specifically?
Unless you develop an elective. I mean, I'm fortunate I teach a Revolutionary War elective, so, unless you have that, regular 11th grade, there's not that much time.
Okay. Thank you. You imply another interesting point in the textbook production side of things, because on the one hand, textbooks are trying to build on whatever Texas and California and New York are doing, because the biggest book sales are in the states with the most people. So they're trying to cater to those curricula, and at the same time, I'm expecting a whole pile of brand new textbooks that are going to cater to the new AP course, which goes thematic and historical skills and has a whole different focus in content. It'll be interesting to see how they juxtapose those two things as the process continues. Yeah.
My name is Jeff. I'm from Wisconsin, and one of the things that we're doing in our building at our high school right now is starting to institute like this character counts type of a program, that kind of thing. And this, how do you work in these great captains? Well, if you can build into like a program like this, like what we're doing, I'm looking at this as an example, and I can say, okay, I can talk to kids, we can identify what makes somebody great, what are characteristics that we would associate with these different types of people, and then you can choose these captains and associate examples of, either their successes or their failures, but those things that made them great men, great leaders, great captains, and you can kind of tie it to something like that, where now these kids are learning about somebody that they've never heard about before, possibly, or making a connection to history that they wouldn't have had before, and you're reaching out and you might be hitting more kids that way. So I can see myself, building in some sort of a lesson about morals or character or personality traits that we would admire and look for, we identify with a leader in a program like this that we're doing at our school. Again, if you're not teaching, it's hard to work some of the stuff into your regular curriculum otherwise, but this might be a good way to do it if you have anything like that in your building that you could do.
Good.
Jeff Bedore, I'm from Naperville, Illinois here. There's a number of things to touch on. I do think a lot of good, several points that were made. I mean, you made one of them, the AP exams and AP, I know I teach AP Euro, also makes the point of saying, literally, don't bother with the military stuff. It's not on the exam. Or the fact that we're increasingly driven by standardized tests that tend to stay away from military history writ large. And then there's an intersection here. I've heard Colonel Herbert speak about this in the past and write about it as well, that there's a reluctance oftentimes among faculty who have no military experience, or either serving or just generally, to teach the subject, either because there's some sense that to teach it is to somehow be an advocate of warfare as a solution, which strikes me as absurd on its face, but that's a different issue. Or the fact that there's a political component to it. Now, the way we solved all of that was we have an elective course, which is specific to military history. And I think that's, given all the other constraints that are sort of come to bear on it, that's the only viable solution that I see to some extent, particularly because of the standardized testing. But I also recognize that given financial constraints right now, that's an unbelievably difficult uphill climb for a lot of people. We did it 10 years ago, and it was tough.
Yeah, I think, on the upside, for people really interested in the subject, having an elective like that's great. On the downside is you still want the whole general population to have some idea of what this is all about. It may be a small percentage that actually serve these days, but obviously we're all dependent on it.
Yeah, it strikes me as it's a difficult thing to get your arms around when you consider that, I'm teaching freshmen, for example, in an ancient history course who are, 4 years old? And in the last 10 or 11 years of their lives, their country has been at war, unceasingly. So to the extent that it's, sometimes considered not a viable subject, I find that rather bizarre, to put it mildly. More specifically on your question about the great captains, the way we deal with issues like that is that our course is a survey course that actually starts in the ancient world. So by the time we get to the kind of people we're talking about now, we've already talked about leadership generally, military leadership, so it becomes a conversation that turns on, is there a difference in military leadership in America, in the Republic? Do we look for there are maybe some qualities of leadership militarily, generally speaking, but is there something more, or is there something required that's different if it's actually American leadership? And you wind up with some very fascinating discussions about that.
Good, thank you.
What I try to do in my school is I do Veterans Day and 9/11 programs, and I bring the actual people into the school. And
where's your school?
At Rocky Point on Long Island. And we've had people, we had one man, he liberated Mauthausen concentration camp, and I brought in one of the people that he liberated. And I don't know what the odds of that is, but it's pretty interesting. The kids just, they eat that stuff up. They see, the speakers, and they hear their stories. And we had another man who was a combat surgeon, I guess in the movie that was depicted in We Were Soldiers. And, we show clips on that. And this past year, we had 3 Vietnam vets. And I actually showed a clip of Forrest Gump and with the fighting and stuff, because they've seen that movie 1,000 times. Yeah. And even the Vietnam vets were getting choked up during the fighting scene. And they kind of compared and contrast their own experiences. And I guess I'll probably show Platoon next year. I just taped it off of TV without the F-bombs and all that stuff in there.
Yeah.
It's a challenge. New York State, it's pretty bad right now, just probably with a lot of other states across the country. And just talking about War of 1812 as an example, the only question I could really remember on the Regents exam is the Hartford Convention. And and that's about it from that. And, you know, sometimes, you know, talking about the military history, they think of it as being a negative. Like, I had gone to school for a second master's degree in military history through Norwich, and I had a fight with my administration to get that. And their argument was, well, you don't teach this all the time. And my, you know, response was, you don't teach 100% of any type of history all the time. And it was pretty funny. I had my union rep next to me. We almost started laughing. And after a couple of days, they said, you know, you may take that course or that program. So.
You remind me, too, I have a list of about 20 films that deal with military history that I show film clips from. The only one I show a long film clip from is Saving Private Ryan, the first 26 minutes. But, you know, provided you can get past the cursing issues with your school district, a lot of these films, you know, inform the kids really well about the experience.
I would definitely bring in the veterans in the community, especially if you do have some war and terror veterans that are willing to speak, because we have been, you know, since 9/11. Yeah. And, you know, I live on Long Island. I'm not too far from the city. And for us, it was 9/11 was huge. So it's something that the kids, when they see the veterans or they see rescue workers come in, that's always a big deal. We had one local story, Michael Murphy, and his story's coming out now in a movie called Lone Survivor through the book that Marcus Luttrell wrote. And they're actually getting done with filming it now in New Mexico. And his father lives only a couple of towns away from our school. And it's the story of the all-American kid that did right in Afghanistan. And, you know, he did his duty. And it's an unbelievable story. It should be coming out in the fall. And, you know, so you could bring these stories in. It's definitely a good thing, and depending on the administration that you have, you know.
Thank you.
So. Michael Weber from Festus High School in Missouri. I'd just like to comment briefly on some of the discussion raised over here by these gentlemen about getting these kids to connect to some of this content. And it also ties in with what you were saying regarding September 11th. I'm finding it's a topic that I typically use year in and year out. And this year I started to really realize how little my sophomores know, simply because they were so young. And the further away we get from September 11th, I'm having to adjust a lot of the discussion based on the fact that these kids, again, have spent their entire lives with Americans involved in Iraq and in Afghanistan. And I don't know if it's just this is the status quo for them now, and that's what makes it difficult for them to connect. It makes it difficult for them to really grasp, maybe because it's just part of the everyday. You know, I remember being 13 years old watching Desert Storm on TV, and just being blown away by what I was seeing. And of course, it goes without saying, we all remember the impact that 9/11 had. To bring that experience up in the classroom, it's just something that I have to be aware of. It's not only a changing world, but every single year we're going to get more and more students who just simply do not remember for their age. So I think that's something to take into consideration whenever we're trying to figure out how to make these kids connect to the material.
Thank you.
Joseph Ostrowski from the San Antonio Independent School District, Travis Early College High School. One thing I've noticed over the years, especially with our seniors, is on their schedule, they have like just filler classes, teacher assistant or whatever, study hall, we call it academic mentoring. While looking at another school district within San Antonio, because we do have 17 school districts within our city, This other school district, Northeast ISD, offers military history from pre-revolutionary Civil War. Then they come on the back semester with from the Reconstruction and everything else up to present, covering the back half of U.S. history from a military perspective. Now, approaching my administration, by next year we should have those courses which have been approved by Texas Educational Agency, and there is a number for them. The problem really comes into administrators don't know this. They don't know that these classes exist. And a lot of teachers don't take that leap into pursuing classes. So, that may be something to look at, is maybe your states do have courses or course numbers, but a lot of administrators are not aware of that. So instead of like a student graduating with their transcript reflecting study hall or some other type of filler elective, having an elective with a military history attached to it could be more appealing when colleges start looking at them when they're applying.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, Angie Dorman from Warden High School in Warden, Washington. This idea of connecting with kids, the thing that I really enjoyed today, and it's something that I try to incorporate, is kids don't like smooth textbooks. They're dull. They say, this is boring. And when you can connect with the flaws that these great captains and great people have, kids really connect with that. I mean, they're absolutely fascinated at the lengths that President Roosevelt went to hide his disability, and it really means something to them because they find that compensation. So that has just been really, really helpful today. I am in a low-income school, and we have about 1,000 students in our entire district, and almost 80% are on free and reduced lunch. So I have the good fortune to be able to teach anything pretty much I want because nobody really cares. and I mean, and that's great and that's terrible. So, we have been fortunate. We have a huge number of kids go into the military. It's okay. We bring military recruiters into our classrooms. I posted a Facebook post, and I had a kid said, "Hey, Mrs. Dorman, that was my unit." He was a National Guard's serving it. We lost two kids in Iraq. It means something. Kids in the community, kids aren't kids, young men in the community have Bronze Stars and Purple Hearts. And when we talk about this, kid goes, "Oh yeah, Greg did this, my cousin, this and that." So, in many ways, my connecting is more with everybody's flaws and then with this commonality of military service. So anyway, it's been a good day. Thank you.
Well, thank you.
Again, on the connection, I'm fortunate enough to live right next to a military base and teach basically mostly military brats. But
which base?
Fort Campbell, Kentucky. I'm from Tennessee, but it's on the border there. The kids, and it's really strange about the connection thing, because even the kids that do have parents in the military, a lot of them are not engaged with their parents' life in the military per se. For example, in class, I had them all raise their hands, who's, military in here, and, over half the class is raising their hand. But I asked a few of them, okay, where's your parents serving right now? And they're in Afghanistan. I'm like, do you know where that is? No clue. Couldn't point out on the map for nothing. Why are they fighting over there? I have no idea. And so I try to make sure, with those kids especially, to bring that home to them. And that draws a little better connection, gives them a little more emphasis on trying to, gain that why perspective, because it's really a shame that they don't know anything about where their parents are at. So I could only imagine what the disconnect is with kids that aren't even in the military.
That's a good example of the size of the disconnect we're talking about.
Now, some things that I have drawn that do connect with them very well. Most of these kids nowadays, especially the boys, really into video games. Fortunately for me, I'm the beginning of the whole video game generation, ColecoVision. Some of you guys probably remember that way back in the day. All right. And I've kept up on that stuff ever since. And a lot of the video games today, some of the first exposure these kids get to some of these military heroes or presidents and things like that are through those things. One of the kids came up to me and was like, when a picture of Kennedy was up on the screen during the Cuban Missile Crisis, he's like, hey, that guy was in Call of Duty Black Ops. You know? And I'm like, he's in Zombies, you know, and I'm like, okay, if that's what we got to do to connect, then so be it, you know. But social media, video games and stuff like that, the kids eat that stuff up right now. And one of the things I was going to suggest as an exercise, you guys might want to try it, I'm going to give it a try when I get back, design a social media page based on military leaders. And just like in social media today, when these kids, you know, engage with each other, sometimes they're doing a little, lack of a better word, smack talking with each other. Do the same kind of thing with military leaders, you know, their failures, their accomplishments, so on and so forth, and just kind of put a little modern twist to it. So, just a couple of suggestions.
Thanks.
George Haldeman, Muscogee High School, and we have military kids again. Colonel Lanning said we serve Scott Air Force Base. I am on a committee this year. We are moving over to Common Core, the national standards next year. I know maybe a lot of you are. And if you look at those standards, you know, it doesn't say you have to teach Winfield Scott. It doesn't say you have to teach this. It talks about the skills, and usually it's interpreting of events, you know, distinguishing between different interpretations and things like that. So that, I think, gives us a lot of opportunity that we can include a lot of things like DBQs, historical inquiry and thinking questions. Bob Bain at the University of Michigan says, you know, always give kids a question on the board of the day and then give them the ability to go out and find the answers to those questions, whether that's through media, other types of primary or secondary sources or whatever. I'm getting ready to start World War I this next week, and I have a lesson I'm getting ready to do. It's about leadership on World War I, and they have to analyze Pershing. He's actually on the list, Haig, Foch, and a few other people. And this lesson, if you like it, is actually on the Truman library. It was developed by a teacher named Tim O'Neill from the St. Louis University, I know personally, and he's a good teacher. And, you know, basically they just have to analyze the strengths and weaknesses of each of these military leaders and then form opinions, creating a majority and dissenting opinions about each of these leaders. And so I think that we can make these people real to me, that was brought up earlier, by giving them chances to see their character strengths and weaknesses and let them decide for themselves, and then, you know, they can make a list then of who they think the greatest leader, you know, of those 5 generals are on there. They can make a list of who the top 5 are, 1 through 5, and then we can go through, and I'm sure everybody will have a different list, and we can talk about those. So I think that's one of the ways that we can really learn to make historical inquiry and thinking, you know, more real and tangible for these students.
Good. PJ?
I'm PJ Shigan, and I teach at a very small classical Christian school outside of Philadelphia, and it's one of the nice things that I really like about coming here is that you realize how differently we all face teaching and in different situations and so forth, but there's always something that I pick up both from other teachers as well as from the speakers. And I was just thinking that one of the good fortunes I have in working with a K through 12 school is that we start our kids at very early ages with an involvement of holidays like Veterans Day or having the advantage of spending time on 9/11. And so at younger ages, we don't get this terrible dearth of knowledge by the time they're in high school and so forth. But another thing that we have a good fortune of is that we have some families, for example, who have some military in their background, and fortunately they are not kind of disembodied from their families. We have a family or two that have a Navy SEAL in their background and so forth. So they are very interested, and we try to use that as an opportunity for learning, both in terms of a mission, what does that mean, and where are they stationed, and we try to teach it in a broad sense, in the sense that you're talking geography, you're talking mission, you're talking political systems, you're talking objectives, and you try to give, at least for us, we try to give a broader picture of that, in addition to the fact that we really are interested in families, and we've organized to send out boxes when we were sending things to Iraq and so forth. But the other thing that I still remember was coming and I don't remember the exact program, but I remember still the use of media that Dr. McDougall gave when he started with that picture of Patton, and it was that kind of blood and guts presentation that you get at the beginning of the movie. And I just thought, I never used stuff like that. And I started trying to do that because I think sometimes it's like taking, this is a poor analogy, but it's like, when you're walking a dog and you think, oh, this dog's just not doing what I want. So you up on the little collar and you give him a little jerk, and it kind of brings students to the present and to whatever you're, trying to lead toward. And I've done that with music, that the kids think, they either start rolling their eyes or they think, whoa, that's pretty cool. But just using both visual and audio and something like that to kind of broaden the appeal of introducing an idea or of, for example, the ideas of the World War I and that sort of thing. And the other thing is, I think sometimes turning something on its head, like World War I or World War II, for example, when you start giving the idea of how many people went to college that would never have gone to college except for the GI Bill, or what the birth rate was and what's going to happen to these kids' opportunities once this particular baby boom generation starts, pulling down their retirement and that sort of thing. I try to turn things upside down sometimes and start at the end and then work back to the beginning rather than just kind of start plotting through the message. And sometimes it really does get more interest that way.
If I could make a few suggestions just from our program today. I mean, I would go back to a school and I would teach a lesson on the myths and the realities of George Washington. We'd create an entire lesson, start by generating what are some of the myths you know about George Washington, and start hearing them, and then have students investigating the myths and throwing out more realities, and a whole lesson could be built right around that topic. Or Andrew Jackson, which Andrew Jackson are we talking about? The aristocrat, champion of the common man, the Indian killer, the guy who adopted an Indian, and go on and on and on to take a look at how complicated a person could be in history. Or the role of luck in careers. We had lots of good examples of that today, whether we were talking about Grant or about Pershing. And then to get students to think about in terms of their parents' lives or other lives, so they can expand from that and see the connection between both common people and famous people, and see, that kind of role that luck plays in everything. Or the idea of wars as training grounds for the next war. Take a look at major people that you normally look at in the war they're best known for, and instead study them in the previous war where they did their earlier service. These are all ideas that came to me today that would make great lessons, regardless of your U.S. history course, assuming that at some point it crosses the paths of these wars or people. Yes? It'll take a second to get live.
Okay. You mentioned George Washington, and I just wanted to throw out there a George Washington lesson that I always use with K-12 kids, and this is worked with elementary, middle school, and high school. I don't know, you could adapt it for other great figures through history or great captains. So I'll get in front of the chalkboard and I'll say, okay, you tell me what you know about George Washington. And they always try to kiss up to me. They say, oh, he was brave, he was handsome, he was loyal, he was smart. And it's literally every time it's always the same thing. And forgive me, I do it with teachers and they do it too. It's the same response. All these endless positive adjectives. So then I catch them up and I say, okay, with the kids, how many of you are just like him? How many of you have got all these qualities? And if they're honest, it's really great, I think, especially with middle school kids. You kind of see them pause and they look at themselves and they're thinking, oh man, I just failed my last test, or my girlfriend just dumped me, or this acne is driving me crazy, or, I'm living at home and I've got my mom, I don't have a dad. or, we're really struggling to make ends meet. So then I'll say, okay, let's talk about some other things about Washington. Single-family home. He was afraid sometimes. He had scars on his face. He had all these other, disadvantages and personality flaws, characteristics. I say, you know what? He started the same place that everybody else does. And he took this journey and how he changed and how he became better. You can take the same journey. And I think some of you were making comments about talking about flaws and talking about personal connections. I think that personal connection with any individual in history is probably the most important thing that you can do.
Thank you very much. Let's see if I can, I think I'm back on here. I could play one more brief thing for you here now. Are you familiar with me? This is on Alexander Hamilton.
I'm thrilled the White House called me tonight because I'm actually working on a hip-hop album. It's a concept album about the life of someone I think embodies hip-hop, Treasury Secretary Alexander Hamilton. You laugh, but it's true. He was born a penniless orphan in St. Croix of illegitimate birth, became George Washington's right-hand man, became Treasury Secretary, caught beef with every other founding father, and all on the strength of his writing. I think he embodies the word's ability to make a difference. So I'm going to be doing the first song from that tonight. I'm accompanied by Tony and Grammy-winning music director Alex Lacamoire. Anything you need to know. I'll be playing Vice President Aaron Burr, and snap along if you like. How does a bastard orphan son of a whore and a Scotsman dropped in the middle of a forgotten spot in the Caribbean by providence, impoverished and squalor, grow up to be a hero and a scholar? The $10 founding father without a father got a lot farther by working a lot harder, by being a lot smarter, by being a self-starter. By 14, they placed him in charge of the trade and charter, and every day while slaves were being slaughtered or carted away across the waves, our Hamilton kept his guard up. Inside he was longing for something to be a part of. The brother was ready to beg, steal, borrow, or barter. Then a hurricane came, devastation reigned, and our man saw his future dripping down the drain. Put a pencil to his temple, connected it to his brain, and he wrote his first refrain, a testament to his pain. Well, the word got around, they said, this kid is insane, man. Took up a collection just to send him to the mainland. Get your education, don't forget from whence you came, and the world is gonna know your name. What's your name, man? Alexander Hamilton. His name is Alexander Hamilton. And there's a million things he hasn't done, but just you wait, just you wait. When he was 10, his father split, full of it, debt-ridden. 2 years later, see Alex and his mother bedridden, half dead, sitting in their own sick, the scent thick, and Alex got better, but his mother went quick. Moved in with a cousin, the cousin committed suicide, left him with nothing but ruined pride, something new inside, a voice saying, Alex, you gotta fend for yourself. He started retreating and reading every treatise on the shelf. There would have been nothing left to do for someone less astute. He would have been dead and destitute without a cent of restitution. Started working, clerking for his late mother's landlord, trading sugar cane and rum and other things he can't afford, scamming for every book he can get his hands on, planning for the future. See him now as he stands on the bow of a ship headed for a new land. In New York, you can be a new man. The ship is in the harbor now, see if you can spot him. Another immigrant coming up from the bottom. His enemies destroyed his rep. America forgot him. And me, I'm the damn fool that shot him. Alexander Hamilton. We were waiting in the weeds for you. You could never back down. You always had to speak your mind. But Alexander Hamilton, we could never take your deeds from you. In our cowardice and our shame, we will try to destroy your name. But don't will never be the same, Alexander. Yeah, I'm the damn genius that shot him. Thank you.
I couldn't resist playing that after you just made the comments about Washington's adversity. And I know there are a lot of Federalists in this crowd anyway. We had a few more comments before I'm going to turn this over to Paul Herbert and tour the museum, an amazing museum.